Hi, I'm Tavric Holtrowe. The first time I attended my wife's family reunion at their Hillcrest estate, I stopped to help a stranded businessman whose car had broken down on the interstate. Because of that, I was 2 hours late. And for being late, they called me dead weight. Sat me at the overflow table like I was some burden they had to tolerate. Her father announced to everyone that I was dragging their daughter down, that successful families don't carry freeloaders. But here's what they didn't know. The man I helped walked into their reunion wearing a three-piece suit and introduced himself as the regional bank president. And what he revealed next didn't just expose their arrogance, it shattered the carefully constructed lie they'd been living for nearly a decade. Because for 8 years, I'd been the one secretly paying the mortgage on that very estate they were so proud of. Want to know how I turned their family reunion into a financial reckoning that left them speechless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun streamed through the windows of our modest apartment in Brookfield as I watched Adeline Kelvane adjust her pearl necklace for the third time. She stood before our bathroom mirror, the same one with the crack running down the left side that I'd been meaning to replace for months. Her reflection looked back at her with the kind of nervous energy that always preceded visits to her family's estate. "You remembered to iron your good shirt, right?" she asked without looking at me, her voice carrying that particular tension that meant today mattered more than usual. I nodded, though she wasn't watching. My good shirt was a navy button-down I'd bought at a department store 3 years ago. It was clean, pressed, and perfectly adequate, but I knew it would pale in comparison to the designer clothing that would fill the Hillcrest estate today. The annual Kelvane family reunion was more fashion show than family gathering, and I'd learned long ago that my presence was tolerated rather than celebrated. "Tavric, promise me you won't bring up work today," Adeline continued, finally turning to face me. "My father's still sensitive about the pharmaceutical company's restructuring. He doesn't need to hear about manufacturing quotas and assembly line efficiency." I managed a smile. "I promise. No talk about the factory." For 8 years, I'd been a production supervisor at North Point Manufacturing, overseeing the assembly of medical devices. It was honest work that paid well enough to cover our expenses and then some, but to the Kelvane family, it might as well have been manual labor. They owned Kelvane Pharmaceuticals, a regional company that had made them wealthy enough to look down on anyone who worked with their hands. The irony wasn't lost on me. Every month for the past 8 years, I'd written a check for $4, $200, and mailed it to Pinnacle Mortgage Company. The payment covered the mortgage on the very estate where Adeline's family would gather today, the same estate where her father, Harrison Kelvane, would undoubtedly make some comment about my lack of ambition or breeding. They thought the family trust paid for everything, but the trust had been depleted years ago by poor investments and Harrison's expensive tastes. Adeline didn't know about the payments, neither did her father, her mother Vivienne, or her brother Sterling. They believed their financial advisor, a family friend named Robert Thorne, had restructured their investments to cover all expenses. What they didn't know was that Robert had come to me 3 years into my marriage to Adeline, hat in hand, explaining that the family was 6 months away from foreclosure. "They're proud people," Robert had said in his office overlooking the Millbrook financial district. "If they knew how bad things really were, it would destroy them. Harrison especially. The man's built his entire identity around being a successful businessman." So I'd stepped in quietly, anonymously. Robert structured it as a private investment opportunity, telling the family that a silent partner had bought into their mortgage at favorable terms. I became that silent partner, taking over payments that represented nearly half my monthly salary. Adeline thought our tight budget was due to her expensive tastes and my modest income. She had no idea I was keeping her family's legacy alive. The drive to Hillcrest usually took 45 minutes, but today we'd need to account for traffic heading to the estate. The reunion drew not just immediate family but cousins, business associates, and carefully selected friends who fit the Kelvane social circle. It was the kind of event where conversations flowed around stock portfolios and vacation homes in the Hamptons, where my presence created awkward silences that Adeline worked overtime to fill. "Remember, if Uncle Gerald starts talking about his yacht again, just nod and smile," Adeline said as we pulled out of our apartment complex. "And please, if you see Cousin Miranda, Don't mention that you've never been to Europe. She's still recovering from her divorce and doesn't need to feel superior to anyone else right now. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. These weren't malicious instructions, just Adeline's way of navigating the minefield that was her family's social expectations. She'd grown up in this world of careful appearances and unspoken hierarchies, where your worth was measured by your address, your alma mater, and your portfolio balance. Marrying me had been her quiet rebellion, though I sometimes wondered if she regretted it. The Kelvane estate sat on 47 acres of manicured grounds in the exclusive Hillcrest neighborhood, where homes started at $2 million and privacy was guaranteed by iron gates and private security. The main house was a colonial revival that Harrison's grandfather had built in the 1920s, all limestone and leaded glass windows, with enough rooms to house a small hotel. Gardens designed by a famous landscape architect surrounded the property, featuring walking paths that meandered past fountains and gazebos, where family photos were traditionally taken. As we turned onto Hillcrest Drive, I could see other cars already making their way toward the estate. Mercedes sedans, BMW SUVs, and the occasional Tesla, all carrying people who belonged in ways I never would. My 10-year-old Honda Accord would find its place in the overflow parking area behind the main house, where the help usually parked, and where family members wouldn't have to see vehicles that might lower the tone of the gathering. "You're quiet today," Adeline observed, reaching over to adjust my collar. "Everything all right?" "Just thinking about work. We're launching a new product line next month, and I've been running scenarios in my head." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. I had been thinking about work, specifically about the overtime I'd been putting in to ensure I could continue making those monthly mortgage payments. The medical device industry was becoming increasingly competitive, and North Point Manufacturing had been forced to cut costs wherever possible. My job was secure for now, but nothing was guaranteed, and the thought of not being able to maintain the payments kept me awake some nights. Adeline's family had no idea how precarious their situation really was. They lived as if the money would always be there, as if the estate was truly paid for and their lifestyle was sustainable. Harrison still belonged to the country club, Vivienne still hired caterers for dinner parties, and Sterling still drove a car that cost more than most people's annual salary. They maintained their illusion of wealth while I quietly ensured they could continue doing so. "Promise me something," Adeline said as we approached the estate gates. "Try to enjoy yourself today. I know my family can be difficult, but they do care about you in their own way." I squeezed her hand. "I promise." The gates opened automatically as we approached, triggered by sensors that recognized family vehicles. As we drove up the circular driveway, I could see the estate in all its maintained glory. The lawn was perfect, the hedges precisely trimmed, the fountains flowing as if money were no object. It was beautiful, impressive, and completely dependent on my monthly checks to survive. Today would be different, though I didn't know it yet. Today, a simple act of kindness would set in motion events that would finally force the truth into the light. Today, the Kelvane family would learn exactly who had been keeping their world intact, and I would discover just how much their gratitude was really worth. The interstate stretched ahead of us like a ribbon of possibility, and for the first time all morning I felt myself beginning to relax. Away from the apartment where every piece of furniture reminded me of compromises made to afford mortgage payments I couldn't discuss. Away from the daily grind of the factory where I supervised teams while mentally calculating whether overtime would be necessary to cover unexpected expenses. Here, with Adeline beside me and the road open ahead, I could almost pretend we were just another couple heading to a family gathering. "I think this will be a good day," Adeline said, checking her makeup in the visor mirror. "Mother mentioned that cousin Patricia is bringing her new boyfriend, some investment banker from the city. It'll be nice to have another outsider there for a change." I wasn't sure if she meant that as comfort for me, or if she was genuinely excited about having someone else navigate the Kelvane social dynamics, but I appreciated the sentiment either way. The family had a way of making outsiders feel like anthropologists studying a foreign culture, always one wrong comment away from revealing their inadequacy. We were making good time, about 20 minutes from the estate, when I noticed the car on the side of the road. A silver sedan, expensive looking but clearly in distress, with its hazard lights blinking and steam rising from under the hood. A man in a business suit stood beside it, cell phone pressed to his ear, gesturing in frustration at whatever conversation he was having. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Poor guy, I murmured, already beginning to slow down. Tavric, no, Adeline said immediately, recognizing the signs. We're going to be late as it is, and you know how Father feels about punctuality. He's probably just waiting for a tow truck. But something about the man's posture spoke to me. He looked defeated in a way that went beyond automotive trouble, like someone who'd been fighting uphill battles all day and was finally ready to surrender. I'd seen that look in my own mirror often enough to recognize it in others. 5 minutes, I said, pulling onto the shoulder about 50 feet ahead of the stranded vehicle. If I can't help, we'll leave right away. Adeline's sigh could have powered a small turbine. This is exactly the kind of thing that makes you late for important events. You can't save everyone, Tavric. I turned off the engine and pocketed the keys. Maybe not, but I can try to save one person today. The man looked up as I approached, ending his phone call with an expression of barely contained frustration. He was probably in his late 50s, with graying hair and the kind of deep lines around his eyes that came from years of making difficult decisions. His suit was well-tailored but wrinkled from the heat, and his tie had been loosened in defeat. "Excuse me," I called out as I approached. "Car trouble?" He managed a rueful smile. "Radiator, I think. Overheated about 10 minutes ago and won't start now. I've called for a tow, but they're saying 2 hours minimum." 2 hours? I whistled low. That's rough. Important appointment? "Board meeting," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Been planning it for months. 3 companies are supposed to finalize a merger agreement today, and I'm supposed to be the one presenting the financial analysis. Without me there to walk them through the numbers, the whole deal could fall apart." I popped the hood of his car and peered inside. The radiator was definitely the problem, along with what looked like a busted water pump. This wasn't a roadside fix, but it wasn't complicated either. More importantly, it was something I understood. "What if I told you I could get you to your meeting?" I asked. He raised an eyebrow. "You're not a mechanic, are you?" "Production supervisor at a manufacturing plant. I've seen my share of overheated machinery. This isn't fixable here, but you don't need it fixed. You just need a ride." The man looked back at his car, then at my Honda, then at me. I could see him making calculations, weighing options, probably wondering if accepting help from a stranger was more or less risky than missing his meeting. "I don't even know your name," he said finally. "Tavric Holtrowe, and you don't have to know me to let me help you." "Richard Bancroft," he replied, extending his hand. "And you're absolutely right. I'm desperate enough to accept help from a complete stranger." As I walked back to my car to explain the situation to Adeline, I could see her preparing for an argument. Her arms were already crossed, and she was wearing the expression she reserved for moments when she felt I was being particularly unreasonable. "Let me guess," she said before I could speak. "You're going to drive him somewhere and make us even later." "His meeting is in Millbrook, 15 minutes past the estate. I can drop him off after the reunion." "Tavric, we're already cutting it close. If we show up late because you decided to play Good Samaritan, Father will never let me hear the end of it." I looked back at Richard, who was gathering papers from his car and clearly trying not to listen to our conversation. He moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd built a career on attention to detail, and I could see the stress radiating from him like heat waves. "What if we take him with us?" I suggested. "Just for an hour or so. He can wait in the car during the reunion, and then I'll drive him to his meeting." Adeline stared at me like I'd suggested we adopt a stray elephant. "You want to bring a stranger to my family's reunion?" "I want to help someone who needs help. Isn't that what decent people do?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with 8 years of accumulated tension about values and priorities. Adeline had married someone who stopped for stranded motorists, but she'd hoped I'd eventually outgrow that impulse in favor of more sophisticated concerns. "Fine," she said finally. "But if this creates problems with my family, you're handling the explanations." Richard was grateful enough to overcome any awkwardness about attending a stranger's family reunion. He climbed into the back seat of the Honda, apologizing for the inconvenience and promising to stay out of the way. As we resumed our drive toward the estate, he and I fell into easy conversation about manufacturing, quality control, and the challenges of managing teams in competitive industries. "You sound like you know your business," Richard said after I'd explained some of the efficiency improvements we'd implemented at North Point. "Ever thought about moving into management consulting?" I caught Adeline's eye in the rearview mirror. I'm pretty comfortable where I am. Steady work, good people, honest pay. Honest pay is underrated, Richard agreed. I've spent 30 years in finance, and I've seen too many people chase money at the expense of everything else. Usually doesn't end well. As we turned into the Hillcrest neighborhood, Richard let out a low whistle. "This is where your family lives?" he asked Adeline. "My family, yes. Not mine, exactly. Beautiful area. I've handled mortgages for a few properties out here over the years. Takes serious money to maintain these places?" I felt my pulse quicken slightly. "You work in mortgages?" "Among other things, I'm regional president for Pinnacle Bank. We handle a lot of the high-end financing in this area." The car suddenly felt very small. Richard Bancroft wasn't just any stranded motorist. He was the president of the bank that held the Kelvane family's mortgage, the same mortgage I'd been paying for 8 years, the same mortgage that kept the estate we were approaching out of foreclosure. "Small world," I managed to say. "Getting smaller every day," Richard replied, looking out at the manicured lawns and iron gates. "You'd be surprised how connected everything really is." As we pulled through the gates of the Kelvane estate, I realized that my simple act of kindness had just introduced a wild card into a carefully controlled environment. Richard Bancroft knew exactly how much the family owed, exactly who was making their payments, and exactly how precarious their situation really was. I just had no idea how much that knowledge was about to change everything. The circular driveway of the Kelvane estate was already crowded with vehicles when we arrived, each one more expensive than the last. Mercedes sedans nestled beside BMW SUVs, while a red Tesla gleamed in the afternoon sun like a technological jewel. My Honda Accord looked like a delivery vehicle that had wandered into the wrong neighborhood, and I could feel Richard taking in the contrast as I parked in the overflow area behind the main house. "Impressive gathering," Richard observed, stepping out and straightening his wrinkled suit. "Your wife's family certainly knows how to live." "They have their standards," I replied, helping him gather his papers and briefcase from the back seat. Adeline had already begun the transformation that always occurred when we arrived at family events. Her posture straightened, her voice took on a more refined cadence, and she seemed to grow taller as she adjusted her pearls and smoothed her dress. This was her natural habitat, the world she'd been born into, and she moved through it with practiced grace. "Remember, just stay close to the car," she told Richard. "The reunion should last about 2 hours. Then Tavric can get you to your meeting." "I appreciate this more than you know," Richard said, settling himself on a stone bench near the parking area. "I'll just review my presentation materials while I wait." The walk from the parking area to the main house took us along a curved pathway lined with perfectly maintained rose bushes. Each step brought us closer to the sound of conversation and laughter drifting from the estate's expansive rear garden, where white tents had been erected to shade the gathering. The Kelvane family reunion was an annual tradition that served multiple purposes, celebrating family connections, showcasing the estate's grandeur, and providing opportunities for business networking among the carefully curated guest list. "There's Mother," Adeline said, waving toward a woman in an elegant blue dress who stood near the main tent. Vivienne Kelvane possessed the kind of refined beauty that came from decades of professional maintenance, and she moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. "Adeline, darling," Vivienne called out, approaching with arms extended for air kisses that wouldn't disturb her makeup. "You look lovely." "And Tavric, so nice to see you again." The greeting was warm enough, but I'd learned to read the subtle gradations in Vivienne's welcomes. Family members received embraces, close friends got genuine smiles, and I received polite acknowledgement that suggested I was a minor character in the day's performance. "Sorry we're a bit late," Adeline said. "Traffic was heavier than expected." "Actually," I added, "we stopped to help someone whose car had broken down." The words were out before I could stop them, and I immediately saw Adeline's slight wince. Family gatherings weren't the place for stories that highlighted my tendency to prioritize strangers over punctuality. "How charitable," Vivienne said with the tone usually reserved for describing quaint but impractical hobbies. "I suppose there's always someone in need of assistance." Harrison Kelvane's voice boomed across the garden before I could respond. "Is that my favorite son-in-law?" The question was rhetorical since I was his only son-in-law, a fact that made the phrase more pointed than affectionate. Harrison approached with the confident stride of a man who'd spent 68 years being the most important person in most rooms. "Harrison," I said, extending my hand for what I knew would be an unnecessarily firm handshake. "Beautiful day for the reunion." "Indeed it is. Though I notice you managed to arrive after most of our guests." "Punctuality is a virtue, you know. In business, being late can cost you everything." The rebuke was delivered with a smile, but it carried the weight of 8 years of accumulated disappointments. Harrison had never quite forgiven me for not being the successful businessman he'd envisioned for his daughter, and he took every opportunity to highlight my shortcomings in ways that felt educational rather than cruel. "Tavric stopped to help someone," Adeline explained, her voice carrying a note of apology. "Ah yes, your famous Good Samaritan complex," Harrison said, turning to address the small group that had gathered around us. "My son-in-law here has never met a stranger in distress he couldn't stop to assist. Very admirable, though not always practical." Cousin Patricia laughed, her new boyfriend nodding along as if he understood the family dynamics. "Some people just can't help themselves. They see someone in trouble and feel compelled to get involved." "It's a character trait," said Uncle Gerald, adjusting his golf shirt. "Usually found in people who work with their hands. Very blue-collar mentality. Not necessarily a bad thing, just different from how those of us in professional environments approach problem-solving." I felt heat rising in my cheeks but forced myself to maintain composure. These weren't intentionally malicious comments, just casual observations from people who'd never questioned their own privilege. To them, stopping to help strangers was a luxury they couldn't afford, a sign of someone who didn't understand the importance of their own time. "Speaking of work," Harrison continued, "how are things at the factory, Tavric? Still supervising the assembly line?" "Production supervision, yes. We're launching a new line of cardiac monitoring devices next month. The technology is really impressive." "Cardiac monitors," repeated Sterling, Adeline's younger brother, with the tone of someone discussing a mildly interesting zoo exhibit. "Must be satisfying to work on something that actually helps people, even if it's not particularly lucrative." The conversation continued in this vein, with family members asking polite questions about my work while making it clear that they viewed it as a noble but ultimately limiting career choice. I was the family curiosity, the working-class husband who'd somehow captured Adeline's attention but never quite measured up to their standards. "The thing about manufacturing," said Cousin Miranda, "is that it's so dependent on economic cycles. When times get tough, those jobs are usually the first to go. It must be stressful, never knowing if you'll be employed next year." "Job security comes from being valuable," I replied. "If you do good work and solve problems, companies tend to keep you around." "That's a lovely sentiment," Harrison said, placing a paternal hand on my shoulder. "But the reality is that in today's economy, real security comes from ownership, not employment, building wealth, not just earning wages." The irony was almost overwhelming. Here was Harrison Kelvane, lecturing me about building wealth while standing on property that I'd been paying for through my wages for 8 years. Every month, my limiting factory job generated enough income to keep his estate out of foreclosure, but he had no idea that his financial security depended entirely on my continued employment. "That's why it's so important to marry well," Vivienne added with a meaningful look at Adeline. "A successful partnership can elevate both people involved." "Exactly," Harrison agreed, "though sometimes one partner carries more weight than the other. It's natural in any relationship, but it can become burdensome if the imbalance is too pronounced." The group fell silent for a moment, and I realized that Harrison wasn't just making casual conversation. This was a deliberate message, delivered in front of family and friends, about my role in his daughter's life. I was the dead weight, the anchor holding back someone who could have done better. "Father," Adeline said quietly, "that's enough. I'm just making an observation, dear. In any successful family, everyone needs to contribute. Some people build businesses, some people manage investments, some people create opportunities. And some people just try to keep up." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around us, conversations gradually resumed as people realized the show was over, but I could feel their eyes on me, measuring my response, waiting to see how the factory worker would handle being put in his place by the successful businessman. I looked around at the beautiful estate, at the perfectly maintained gardens, at the family who lived their lives believing they'd earned all of this through superior intelligence and harder work. They had no idea that their entire world depended on a man they considered dead weight, a man who quietly sacrificed half his income every month to maintain their illusions. "You're absolutely right, Harrison," I said finally. "Everyone should contribute according to their abilities. Some people just contribute in ways that aren't immediately visible." Harrison smiled, satisfied that he'd made his point without creating a scene. "Exactly. As long as everyone knows their place, families can function smoothly." As the group dispersed to rejoin the larger party, I found myself standing alone near the rose garden, looking back toward the parking area where Richard Bancroft waited patiently on his stone bench. He'd witnessed none of the conversation, had no idea what had just transpired, but his presence suddenly felt like a lifeline in stormy waters. In a few hours, I would drive him to his meeting, completing the act of kindness that had made me late to this gathering. What I didn't know was that Richard's gratitude would soon give me the opportunity to show the Kelvane family exactly who was carrying the real weight in their carefully constructed world. The afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the horizon when I noticed the disturbance near the main entrance of the estate. Conversations paused as heads turned toward the circular driveway, where a silver sedan was pulling up to the front of the house. This was unusual because all guests had been expected to arrive by 2 o'clock, and it was now nearly 4. More unusual still was the fact that someone was arriving in a car that had clearly seen better days, steam still visible from under its partially opened hood. I was standing near the buffet table, having excused myself from a conversation about yacht maintenance that I couldn't meaningfully contribute to, when I saw Richard Bancroft step out of the sedan. Gone was the wrinkled suit and defeated posture from our roadside encounter. He now wore a crisp navy blazer that he must have retrieved from his car, his hair was perfectly arranged, and he moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Who is that?" I heard Vivienne ask someone behind me. "I have no idea," came the reply, "but he certainly knows how to make an entrance." Richard surveyed the garden party with the practiced eye of someone who'd attended countless similar events. The white tents, the carefully arranged flowers, the guests in their summer finest, all of it registered with him as he began walking purposefully in my direction. Every step brought him closer to where I stood, and I could feel the curious stares of the Kelvane family following his progress. "Tavric," Richard called out when he was still 20 feet away, his voice carrying clearly across the garden. "I hope you don't mind me interrupting your family gathering." The conversations around me died completely. Harrison looked up from his discussion with Uncle Gerald, a slight frown creasing his forehead. Adeline appeared at my elbow, confusion evident in her expression. Sterling stopped mid-sentence in whatever story he'd been telling Cousin Patricia's boyfriend. "Richard," I said, walking toward him with extended hand, "I thought you were waiting by the parking area." "I was, but then I realized something important." He clasped my hand firmly, holding it longer than a typical handshake required. "I never properly thanked you for what you did today." His voice carried in the stillness, reaching every corner of the gathering. I was acutely aware that we'd become the center of attention, though I wasn't sure why this moment felt so significant. "It was nothing," I said. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," Richard replied, his tone becoming more serious. "Anyone would not have done the same thing. Do you know how many cars passed me on that highway before you stopped? Dozens. Maybe hundreds. People saw a man in distress and decided it wasn't their problem." Harrison had begun moving closer, drawn by curiosity about this unexpected guest who seemed to know his son-in-law. Vivienne followed, along with most of the family members who'd been within earshot. "You don't understand," Richard continued, addressing me but speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I wasn't just having car trouble. I was on my way to the most important meeting of my career. 3 companies, 18 months of negotiations, a merger that could reshape the entire regional banking industry. Without my financial analysis, the whole deal would have collapsed." "Did you make your meeting?" Adeline asked, apparently unable to contain her curiosity. Richard turned toward her with a smile that somehow managed to be both warm and predatory. "I did indeed. Thanks to your husband's generosity, I was able to present the merger proposal that will create the largest independent bank in the tri-state area. We finalized the agreement about an hour ago." A murmur ran through the gathered family members. Banking mergers were the kind of business news that people in their circle paid attention to, the sort of development that could affect property values and investment portfolios. "And you are?" Harrison asked, extending his hand with the automatic courtesy that successful men showed to other successful men. Richard Bancroft, regional president of Pinnacle Bank. The name hit the gathering like a small explosion. Pinnacle Bank was one of the most prestigious financial institutions in the area, handling mortgages and investment portfolios for many of the families in the Hillcrest neighborhood. Several people in the crowd would recognize the name, and all of them would understand its significance. Harrison's handshake became noticeably more enthusiastic. "Mr. Bancroft, what an unexpected pleasure. I don't believe we've met, though I'm certainly familiar with your institution's reputation." "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Kelvane, though I have to say the real credit for my being here belongs to Tavric. If he hadn't stopped to help a complete stranger, I'd still be sitting on the side of Interstate 95 watching my career implode." "Tavric helped you?" Sterling asked, as if the concept required explanation. "More than helped, he rescued me. Saw a man in trouble and didn't hesitate to get involved, even though it made him late for your family gathering. That's character, and character is rare in business." I could feel the atmosphere of the gathering shifting around me, like weather patterns before a storm. The same family members who'd been making gentle jokes about my tendency to help strangers were now reassessing their comments in light of this new information. "Character is indeed important," Harrison agreed, though his tone suggested he was still processing this development. "Though I have to say, I'm surprised Tavric didn't mention he'd helped someone so prominent." "Would it have mattered?" Richard asked, the question sharp enough to cut through Harrison's diplomatic phrasing. Should kindness be conditional on the recipient's social status? The challenge was delivered politely, but unmistakably. Richard Bancroft had just questioned the fundamental assumption underlying the Kelvane family's treatment of me, and he'd done it in front of their friends and relatives. "Of course not," Vivienne said quickly. "We're very proud of Tavric's generous nature." "Are you?" Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. "Because from what I observed during my wait in the parking area, it seemed like his generosity was viewed as something of a character flaw." A flush crept up Harrison's neck. "I'm sure you misunderstood whatever you might have overheard." "Perhaps, but I didn't mishear your comment about some people carrying dead weight in relationships." "That was your phrase, wasn't it? Dead weight?" The garden party had gone completely silent. Even the catering staff seemed to have paused in their duties, sensing the tension that had suddenly filled the air. Harrison's face cycled through several expressions before settling on defensive anger. "I think there may have been some confusion," he said stiffly. "No confusion at all," Richard replied smoothly. "I have excellent hearing, and I was sitting close enough to follow the entire conversation. Your son-in-law was described as dead weight, who doesn't understand the importance of building wealth, rather than simply earning wages." Sterling stepped forward, apparently deciding his father needed support. "Mr. Bancroft, I think you may have taken some casual conversation out of context." "Did I?" Because what struck me as particularly interesting was the irony of the situation. "What irony?" Adeline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard looked around the gathering, taking in the beautiful estate, the manicured gardens, the obvious wealth on display. "Well, speaking as someone who spent 30 years in banking, I can tell you that maintaining a property like this requires significant ongoing financial resources. Property taxes alone on an estate this size must run well into 6 figures annually." "We're quite comfortable," Harrison said carefully. "I'm sure you are. Though I have to say, in my experience, families who describe their employees as dead weight are usually operating from positions of unshakable financial security. Otherwise, they might be more appreciative of steady, reliable income." The words were delivered casually, almost conversationally, but they carried an undercurrent that made several family members exchange nervous glances. Richard Bancroft was clearly leading somewhere, and his destination was beginning to make everyone uncomfortable. "Mr. Bancroft," Harrison said, "while I appreciate your gratitude toward Tavric, I'm not sure this is the appropriate venue for discussing personal financial matters." "You're absolutely right," Richard agreed. "Personal financial matters should remain private. Unless, of course, they become relevant to understanding someone's true contribution to a family's well-being." He turned toward me, his expression suddenly serious. "Tavric, I hope you'll forgive me for what I'm about to say, but sometimes people need to hear uncomfortable truths." I nodded, though I had no idea what was coming. Richard addressed the gathered family members with the calm authority of someone delivering a board presentation. "For 8 years, this man has been making monthly payments of $4,200 to Pinnacle Bank. Those payments represent approximately half of his take-home salary from his factory job. Without those payments, this estate would have been foreclosed upon 3 years ago. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the fountain at the far end of the garden, the distant sound of traffic on the highway, even the faint rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Harrison's face had gone completely white. "That's impossible. I'm the regional president of the bank that holds your mortgage, Mr. Kelvane. I have access to every payment record, every transaction detail, every communication between our institution and your family's financial advisor. Tavric Holtrowe has been the sole reason this property hasn't been seized for non-payment." Vivienne's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the stone patio. Sterling looked like he'd been physically struck. Cousin Patricia's mouth hung open in undisguised shock. "The dead weight you've all been so concerned about," Richard continued, "has been carrying the entire financial burden of maintaining your family's legacy. While you've been worrying about his lack of ambition, he's been sacrificing his own financial security to preserve yours." Adeline turned toward me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Tavric, is this true?" Before I could answer, Richard pulled out his cell phone. "Would you like me to show you the payment records? I have access to our mobile banking platform. Every transaction is documented." "That won't be necessary," I said quietly. "Yes, it will," Harrison snapped, his voice shaking with either rage or humiliation. "If these accusations are true, I want to see proof." Richard's fingers moved across his phone's screen with practiced efficiency. Within moments, he was holding the device toward Harrison, displaying a detailed payment history that showed 8 years of monthly transfers from Tavric Holtrowe to Pinnacle Bank mortgage account number 447188292156. The account number meant nothing to most of the gathering, but Harrison recognized it immediately. His face went from white to gray as he stared at the screen, seeing undeniable proof that everything Richard had said was true. "How?" was all he managed to say. "Your financial advisor, Robert Thorne, arranged it," Richard explained. "He came to Tavric when your family was facing foreclosure, explained the situation, and asked for help. Tavric agreed to take over the mortgage payments anonymously, allowing your family to maintain the illusion that your investments were covering your expenses. The revelations were coming too fast for anyone to process completely. 8 years of assumptions, 8 years of condescension, 8 years of treating me like a financial burden to the family, all of it crumbling in the space of a few minutes." "But why?" Vivienne whispered. "Why would you do that?" I looked around at the faces staring back at me, some shocked, some ashamed, some still struggling to understand. These were the people who'd spent years making me feel small, making me feel inadequate, making me feel like I didn't belong in their world. "Because," I said finally, "I loved your daughter, and I thought family was supposed to take care of each other." The past tense wasn't lost on anyone, least of all, Adeline. The evening air had grown cooler as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the Kelvane estate gardens. Most of the reunion guests had departed within an hour of Richard's revelations, making polite excuses about early dinners and evening plans, while their eyes betrayed the hungry curiosity that would fuel weeks of gossip in their social circles. The catering staff moved efficiently through the emptying space, dismantling tables and collecting abandoned champagne glasses with the practiced discretion of people who'd witnessed family drama before. I sat alone on the stone bench where Richard had waited earlier, watching the cleanup unfold while my mind struggled to process everything that had just happened. 8 years of secret payments, exposed in a matter of minutes. 8 years of careful anonymity, shattered by a chance encounter with a stranded motorist. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so devastating. Richard had departed shortly after delivering his bombshell, apologizing for the disruption, but explaining that he couldn't stand by and watch good people be diminished by those who should have valued them. His final handshake had carried the weight of genuine respect, and his business card bore a handwritten note. "Call me Monday. We should discuss your future." Now, as the afternoon's warmth faded into evening chill, I found myself alone with the wreckage of relationships that had taken years to build and minutes to destroy. Adeline had retreated into the house with her mother, ostensibly to help coordinate the cleanup, but really to escape the uncomfortable stares of departing relatives. Harrison and Sterling had disappeared into the library, their raised voices occasionally audible through the closed French doors. "Tavric?" The voice belonged to Miranda, Adeline's cousin, who approached hesitantly from the direction of the house. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" I gestured to the space beside me on the bench. Miranda had always been one of the more tolerable family members, less overtly condescending than her relatives, though still clearly part of their privileged world. "I wanted to apologize," she said, settling herself carefully on the stone surface, "for my comment about manufacturing jobs being insecure. That was thoughtless and cruel, especially considering what we know now." "You couldn't have known," I replied. "That was the whole point." "But that's just it," Miranda continued, her voice gaining strength. "We should have known. Not about the mortgage payments specifically, but about you. About who you really are. We've spent 8 years treating you like some kind of charity case that Adeline brought home, and it turns out you've been the one keeping this whole family afloat." She paused, looking out across the gardens that my monthly payments had helped maintain. "It makes me wonder what else we've been wrong about. What other assumptions we've made based on nothing but our own prejudices." "People see what they expect to see," I said. "Your family expected to see someone beneath their station, so that's what they saw. God, we're awful people, aren't we?" The question hung between us, loaded with genuine self-reflection that I hadn't expected from any of the Kelvains. Miranda had always struck me as somewhat vapid, more concerned with social events and fashion than substantive issues. But her distress seemed authentic. "You're people who've never had to question your assumptions about how the world works," I said carefully. "That doesn't make you awful, just limited." "Tavric, can I ask you something, and please be honest with me?" I nodded. "Do you love my cousin? Because if you do, maybe there's a way to get past this. Maybe the family can change, can learn to appreciate what you've done." The question struck deeper than I'd expected. Did I still love Adeline? Had I ever truly loved her, or had I simply been grateful for her attention? After 8 years of marriage, the distinction had become blurred beyond recognition. "I loved the woman I thought she was," I said finally. "I'm not sure that woman actually exists." Miranda winced. "That's fair. Adeline has always been good at being what people wanted her to be. Sometimes I think she forgets who she really is underneath all the performance. The performance is who she really is. That's what I'm starting to understand." We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the last of the catering equipment being loaded into trucks. The estate was returning to its normal pristine state, as if the afternoon's drama had never occurred. "Miranda," I said eventually, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Have you ever heard the family discuss selling the estate? Moving somewhere smaller, maybe downsizing?" Her laugh was bitter. "Are you kidding? This place is Uncle Harrison's identity. He'd rather die than give up the Kelvain estate. He's always talking about passing it down to future generations, about maintaining the family legacy. Even though they can't afford it? Especially because they can't afford it. The harder it becomes to maintain, the more important it becomes to him. It's like he thinks selling would be admitting failure, admitting that he's not the successful businessman he's spent his whole life pretending to be." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Miranda, what did you mean by pretending to be?" She looked at me sharply, as if suddenly realizing she'd said more than she intended. "I probably shouldn't have said that." "But you did say it." "What don't I know about Harrison's business?" Miranda glanced toward the house, checking to make sure we weren't being overheard. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Kelvain Pharmaceuticals has been struggling for years. The company my grandfather built, that Uncle Harrison inherited, it's basically a shell now. They lost their major contracts 3 years ago when a competitor developed better formulations for half the cost. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. 3 years ago, that's when Robert Thorne first approached me about the mortgage payments. Is it? I wouldn't know the timing exactly, but it makes sense. Uncle Harrison has been desperately trying to keep up appearances, while everything falls apart around him. The company, the country club memberships, even the family trust. It's all been hemorrhaging money for years. How do you know all this? Because Sterling told me. He's been working for the company since college, and he's terrified about what's going to happen when the whole thing finally collapses. They've been propping up the business with personal funds, using credit and loans to meet payroll and maintain operations. My mind raced through the implications. The Kelvane family hadn't just been unable to afford their mortgage, they'd been facing complete financial ruin. My monthly payments hadn't just preserved their home, they'd been the foundation that allowed Harrison to maintain the illusion of success that kept his business relationships intact. Miranda, are you telling me that my mortgage payments have been subsidizing a failing business? I don't know the details, but probably. Uncle Harrison has always treated the estate as collateral for his business ventures. If this place had been foreclosed, he would have lost his primary asset for securing loans and credit lines. The scope of the deception was staggering. For 8 years, I'd believed I was helping preserve a family's cherished home. In reality, I'd been unknowingly propping up Harrison's business empire, allowing him to maintain creditworthiness while his company slowly died. There's something else, Miranda said reluctantly, something Sterling mentioned that you should probably know. What? They've been discussing divorce proceedings for you and Adeline, I mean. Uncle Harrison hired a lawyer months ago to explore options for protecting family assets in case your marriage ended. The words hit me like ice water. Protecting assets from what? From you, from any claim you might have on family property or businesses. They were trying to figure out how to minimize your financial stake in anything connected to the Kelvane name. I stood up abruptly, needing to move, needing to process this latest betrayal. Not only had the family been accepting my financial support while treating me with contempt, they'd been actively planning to eliminate me from their lives while keeping the benefits of my contributions. How long have they been planning this? I don't know exactly, but Sterling mentioned it around Christmas, so at least several months. And Adeline? Miranda's silence was answer enough. I looked back toward the house, where warm light glowed in the windows, and the family was undoubtedly discussing damage control strategies. These people had accepted 8 years of financial support, while simultaneously planning to discard me at their convenience. They'd taken my money while viewing me as a temporary inconvenience to be managed and eventually eliminated. Tavric, Miranda said softly, what are you going to do? I pulled out my cell phone and opened my banking app, navigating to the automatic payment system that had been transferring money to Pinnacle Bank every month for 8 years. My finger hovered over the cancellation button. I'm going to stop being dead weight, I said, and pressed delete. The confirmation screen asked if I was sure I wanted to cancel the recurring payment. I selected yes and watched as 8 years of financial sacrifice officially came to an end. What happens now? Miranda asked. I looked up at the estate that would soon receive its first mortgage payment notice in nearly a decade. Now they get to find out what carrying real dead weight actually feels like. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Adeline. We need to talk. Please come inside. I showed the message to Miranda, who read it and shook her head. Let me guess, she said. Now that they know the truth, they want to negotiate. They want to find a way to keep the money flowing while maintaining their superiority. Probably. Are you going to go in there? I considered the question while looking at the house where I'd spent 8 years feeling inadequate, 8 years accepting condescension, 8 years believing that love meant sacrifice without recognition or respect. No, I said finally. I think I'm done talking to people who only value me for what I can give them. Instead, I walked toward the parking area where my Honda waited. It was time to go home to the apartment I could finally afford to improve, to the life I could finally afford to live, to the future I could finally afford to plan. Behind me, the Kelvane estate glowed in the gathering darkness, beautiful and doomed, a monument to the illusion that appearance matters more than substance. In 30 days, they would receive their first mortgage payment notice. In 60 days, they would face their first late fee. In 90 days, they would begin to understand what it meant to lose everything you'd taken for granted. I drove away without looking back, leaving them to figure out how to carry their own weight for the first time in 8 years. The silence in my apartment that evening was different from any quiet I'd experienced in 8 years. It wasn't the tense silence of walking on eggshells around Adeline's mood, or the uncomfortable silence of family gatherings where I never quite belonged. This was the silence of possibility, of a life suddenly freed from constraints I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten they weren't permanent. I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, staring at the banking confirmation on my phone screen. Recurring payment canceled. 3 simple words that represented the end of an era, and the beginning of something I couldn't yet define. My phone had been buzzing steadily for the past 2 hours. Missed calls from Adeline, from Vivienne, even one from Sterling. But I'd turned the ringer off after the first dozen attempts. The apartment felt larger somehow, as if canceling those payments had physically expanded the space. The cramped living room where we'd argued about money, the narrow bedroom where Adeline complained about our modest furniture, the tiny kitchen where I'd calculated and recalculated monthly budgets to accommodate mortgage payments I couldn't discuss. All of it looked different now, infused with potential rather than limitation. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I wouldn't answer unknown calls this late, but something about the persistence of the ring made me reconsider. "Mr. Holtrowe, this is Richard Bancroft. I hope I'm not calling too late." Richard: "No, not too late at all. I assume you heard about what happened after you left." Word travels fast in banking circles, especially when it involves prominent families like the Kelvains. "I wanted to check on you, make sure you're handling everything all right." I leaned back in my chair, surprised by the genuine concern in his voice. "I'm processing it all. It's been an educational afternoon." "I imagine so. Listen, I know this might seem presumptuous, but would you be available to meet tomorrow morning? There are some things we should discuss, and I'd prefer to do it in person." "What kind of things?" "The kind that might change your perspective on what's possible for your future. Can you meet me at the Pinnacle Bank building downtown? Say, 9 o'clock. I looked back toward the house, where warm light glowed in the windows, and the family was undoubtedly discussing damage control strategies. These people had accepted 8 years of financial support, while simultaneously planning to discard me at their convenience. They'd taken my money while viewing me as a temporary inconvenience to be managed and eventually eliminated. "Tavric," Miranda said softly, "what are you going to do?" I pulled out my cell phone and opened my banking app, navigating to the automatic payment system that had been transferring money to Pinnacle Bank every month for 8 years. My finger hovered over the cancellation button. "I'm going to stop being dead weight," I said, and pressed delete. The confirmation screen asked if I was sure I wanted to cancel the recurring payment. I selected yes and watched as 8 years of financial sacrifice officially came to an end. "What happens now?" Miranda asked. I looked up at the estate that would soon receive its first mortgage payment notice in nearly a decade. Now they get to find out what carrying real dead weight actually feels like. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Adeline. "We need to talk. Please come inside." I showed the message to Miranda, who read it and shook her head. "Let me guess," she said. "Now that they know the truth, they want to negotiate. They want to find a way to keep the money flowing while maintaining their superiority." "Probably." "Are you going to go in there?" I considered the question while looking at the house where I'd spent 8 years feeling inadequate, 8 years accepting condescension, 8 years believing that love meant sacrifice without recognition or respect. "No," I said finally. "I think I'm done talking to people who only value me for what I can give them." Instead, I walked toward the parking area where my Honda waited. It was time to go home to the apartment I could finally afford to improve, to the life I could finally afford to live, to the future I could finally afford to plan. Behind me, the Kelvain estate glowed in the gathering darkness, beautiful and doomed, a monument to the illusion that appearance matters more than substance. In 30 days, they would receive their first mortgage payment notice. In 60 days, they would face their first late fee. In 90 days, they would begin to understand what it meant to lose everything you'd taken for granted. I drove away without looking back, leaving them to figure out how to carry their own weight for the first time in 8 years. The silence in my apartment that evening was different from any quiet I'd experienced in 8 years. It wasn't the tense silence of walking on eggshells around Adeline's mood, or the uncomfortable silence of family gatherings where I never quite belonged. This was the silence of possibility, of a life suddenly freed from constraints I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten they weren't permanent. I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, staring at the banking confirmation on my phone screen. Recurring payment canceled. 3 simple words that represented the end of an era, and the beginning of something I couldn't yet define. My phone had been buzzing steadily for the past 2 hours. Missed calls from Adeline, from Vivienne, even one from Sterling, but I'd turned the ringer off after the first dozen attempts. The apartment felt larger somehow, as if canceling those payments had physically expanded the space. The cramped living room where we'd argued about money, the narrow bedroom where Adeline complained about our modest furniture, the tiny kitchen where I'd calculated and recalculated monthly budgets to accommodate mortgage payments I couldn't discuss. All of it looked different now, infused with potential rather than limitation. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I wouldn't answer unknown calls this late, but something about the persistence of the ring made me reconsider. "Mr. Holtrowe, this is Richard Bancroft. I hope I'm not calling too late." Richard: "No, not too late at all. I assume you heard about what happened after you left." Word travels fast in banking circles, especially when it involves prominent families like the Kelvains. "I wanted to check on you, make sure you're handling everything all right." I leaned back in my chair, surprised by the genuine concern in his voice. "I'm processing it all. It's been an educational afternoon." "I imagine so. Listen, I know this might seem presumptuous, but would you be available to meet tomorrow morning? There are some things we should discuss, and I'd prefer to do it in person." "What kind of things?" "The kind that might change your perspective on what's possible for your future. Can you meet me at the Pinnacle Bank building downtown, say 9 o'clock? He set down his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly. "Because I have a proposition for you. But first, I need to ask you some questions about your background and experience." For the next hour, Richard conducted what felt like the most thorough job interview of my life. He asked about my education, my work history, my management experience at North Point Manufacturing. He wanted to know about specific problems I'd solved, teams I'd led, processes I'd improved. His questions revealed a detailed understanding of manufacturing operations that surprised me. "You mentioned yesterday that you supervise production of cardiac monitoring devices," he said. "Tell me about the quality control protocols you've implemented." I described the systems we developed to ensure device reliability, the statistical analysis methods we used to identify potential failures, and the training programs I'd created for assembly line workers. Richard took notes throughout, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest in the technical details. "Impressive," he said finally. "Now let me tell you why I'm so interested in your experience. Pinnacle Bank is in the process of acquiring 3 smaller community banks as part of our regional expansion. One of those banks, Millbrook Community Trust, has been hemorrhaging money for 2 years due to operational inefficiencies and poor management oversight." He pulled out a folder from his desk and spread several documents across the coffee table between us. "The bank's board of directors has given us 6 months to turn the operation around, or they'll recommend closure. We need someone who understands systems analysis, quality control, and team management to lead the restructuring effort." "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you an opportunity. Operations manager for Millbrook Community Trust, reporting directly to me. Base salary of $95,000, plus performance bonuses tied to specific improvement metrics. Full benefits, 4 weeks vacation, and equity participation in the bank's long-term success." The numbers were staggering. $95,000 was more than double my current salary, enough to completely transform my financial situation. But more than the money, the role itself sounded challenging and meaningful in ways my factory job had never been. "Why me?" I asked. "You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you helped a stranger without expecting anything in return. I know you've demonstrated financial reliability and personal integrity over 8 years of secret sacrifice. I know you understand manufacturing operations, quality systems, and team leadership. Most importantly, I know you're not afraid of hard work or difficult decisions." He gestured toward the documents on the table. "Millbrook Community Trust serves working families, small business owners, and people who don't have access to the kind of elite banking services we provide here at Pinnacle. Turning it around isn't just good business, it's good for the community. I think you'd find the work rewarding." I picked up one of the documents, a detailed analysis of the bank's current operations. The problems were extensive, but not insurmountable. Outdated computer systems, inefficient loan processing procedures, inadequate staff training, and a management structure that prioritized appearances over results. It was exactly the kind of systematic challenge I'd learned to address in manufacturing environments. "There's something else you should know," Richard said. "Part of our expansion strategy involves developing new financial products for working families. People who've been underserved by traditional banking because they don't meet certain income or asset thresholds. Your background gives you insights into that market that most banking executives simply don't have." "What kind of products?" Mortgage assistance programs for first-time buyers, small business loans with reasonable terms, financial literacy education. The kinds of services that help people build wealth rather than just manage existing wealth. The vision was compelling, but I needed to understand the broader context. Richard, is this offer connected to what happened yesterday? Because if you're trying to help me out of sympathy, this offer exists because I think you can do the job, he interrupted. The timing is connected to yesterday's events only because they revealed qualities I'd already observed. You've been managing complex financial obligations while maintaining professional responsibilities and personal relationships. That's exactly the kind of multitasking and judgment the position requires. He stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the city below. Let me ask you something. What are your plans for the next 30 days? I'm not sure what you mean. The Kelvane family will receive their first mortgage payment notice in 3 weeks. They'll have 30 days to bring the account current or face foreclosure proceedings. Based on what you've told me about their financial situation, they don't have the resources to make that payment. What do you think will happen? I considered the question. They'll panic, probably try to find new financing or sell assets. And when they can't find financing because their credit is compromised, and they can't sell assets quickly enough to generate sufficient cash, they'll come to me, they'll beg me to resume the payments. Exactly. And how do you think that conversation will go? The thought of Harrison Kelvane humbling himself enough to ask for my help was almost impossible to imagine. For 8 years, he'd treated me like a necessary evil to be tolerated. Now he'd be forced to admit that his family's survival depended on the man he'd called dead weight. It'll be difficult for everyone involved, I said finally. It will, unless you have better options. Richard returned to his chair and picked up a pen from the coffee table. If you accept this position, you'll be starting a new career that could lead anywhere you want it to go. Banking, consulting, executive management, all of it becomes possible when you have the right experience and the right connections. He wrote something on a piece of paper and slid it across the table. This is my personal cell phone number. I'm flying to Chicago tomorrow for a board meeting, but I'll be back Wednesday. Take the time to think about everything we've discussed. If you're interested, call me and we'll work out the details. I pocketed the paper, though I was already certain of my answer. Can I ask you one more question? Of course. Yesterday, when you walked into that reunion, you knew exactly who the Kelvanes were, didn't you? You knew about their financial situation before I ever mentioned their name. Richard smiled, and for the first time since I'd met him, his expression carried a hint of calculation. I told you I handle mortgages for several properties in the Hillcrest neighborhood. When you mentioned attending a family reunion at an estate in that area, it wasn't difficult to connect the dots. So helping me wasn't entirely altruistic. Does that matter? Good business and good ethics aren't mutually exclusive. Helping you helps the bank, helps the community, and gives you opportunities you deserve. Everyone wins, except people who've been taking advantage of your generosity. As I left the Pinnacle Bank building and walked toward my car, I realized that everything in my life was about to change. In 3 days, I would call Richard and accept the position. In 2 weeks, I would start working at Millbrook Community Trust, learning banking operations and developing skills I'd never imagined possessing. In 3 weeks, when the Kelvane family received their mortgage payment notice, I would be building a new career rather than subsidizing their old illusions. The afternoon sun felt warmer than it had in years, and for the first time since meeting Adeline, I was genuinely excited about the future. Not because I was escaping something, but because I was finally moving towards something worth building. The drive back to my apartment in Brookfield gave me time to think, but not enough time to process everything that had happened. My phone had buzzed 17 times during the 40-minute journey, each notification representing another desperate attempt by the Kelvane family to re-establish contact. I turned off the ringer after the 10th call from Adeline, choosing silence over the inevitable pleading that would follow. Richard Bancroft's business card sat on my passenger seat, his handwritten note visible in the dim glow of passing streetlights. Call me Monday. We should discuss your future. The words carried more weight now than they had when he'd first written them. Back then, they'd seemed like polite networking. Now they felt like a lifeline. My apartment building looked different as I pulled into the parking lot. The same chipped concrete steps, the same flickering security light, the same mailboxes that needed paint. But for the first time in 8 years, this place represented possibility rather than limitation. Without mortgage payments consuming half my income, I could actually afford to live here instead of simply surviving. Inside, I poured myself a glass of water and sat at my small kitchen table with Richard's card. The smart thing would be to wait until Monday, to approach this methodically during business hours. But tonight had shattered any pretense of playing by normal rules. I dialed his number. Tavric. Richard's voice came through clearly after just 2 rings. I was hoping you'd call. How are you holding up? Still processing, I admitted. But I wanted to thank you for what you did today. You didn't have to expose their situation like that. Actually, I did. In my line of work, you see a lot of people who mistake inherited privilege for personal accomplishment. What your in-laws did to you today wasn't just rude, it was morally bankrupt. I could hear papers rustling in the background, the sound of someone working late into the evening. Richard, can I ask you something? How bad is their financial situation really? Worse than they know, he replied without hesitation. The mortgage is just the beginning. I spent the afternoon reviewing their complete portfolio. After our encounter today, they have credit lines secured against the estate, business loans tied to Harrison's pharmaceutical company, and investment commitments they can't possibly meet. Investment commitments? Harrison pledged significant capital to several development projects based on projected income that doesn't exist. When those commitments come due, and they will within the next 6 months, he'll face lawsuits that could force liquidation of everything. The scope of the disaster was staggering. So even if they could somehow resume the mortgage payments, they'd still be facing financial collapse? Correct. Your payments were the foundation that allowed everything else to stay propped up. Without that stability, the entire structure collapses. I walked to my living room window, looking out at the modest neighborhood that had always felt temporary. What happens now? That depends on what you want to happen. You have more power in this situation than you realize. What do you mean? Richard's voice took on the tone of someone explaining a business strategy. You've been making payments on a mortgage that's in their name, but you have 8 years of bank records proving consistent financial contribution to maintaining the property. Depending on how this plays out legally, you could have legitimate claims on the equity. The thought hadn't occurred to me. I don't want their house, Richard. I just want them to understand what they've lost. I respect that. But you should understand your options before making any decisions. More importantly, you should understand theirs. Their options? They're going to try to manipulate you back into making payments. Harrison will probably offer some kind of partnership arrangement, official recognition of your contributions, maybe even a stake in the pharmaceutical company. Vivienne will appeal to your love for Adeline. Sterling will try to convince you that the family has learned their lesson. His prediction sounded exactly like the conversations I'd been avoiding by turning off my phone. The question is, what do you actually want from this situation? I sat down in my worn armchair, the same one I'd bought secondhand when Adeline and I first moved in together. 8 years of sitting in this chair, planning budgets, calculating whether I could afford small luxuries while secretly funding their estate. I want them to take responsibility for their own lives, I said finally. I want them to stop using people they consider beneath them. And I want Adeline to understand that love isn't a transaction. Those are good goals. Achievable ones too if you're willing to be strategic about this. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that we make this a learning experience for everyone involved. You have documentation of every payment, every conversation with Robert Thorne, every month where you chose their financial security over your own comfort. That's powerful evidence of systematic exploitation. The word exploitation hung in the air between us. I'd never thought of it that way, but Richard was right. The Kelvane family had built their lifestyle on my labor while actively diminishing my worth. What would being strategic look like? It would look like documentation, formal records of exactly what you've contributed and exactly how you've been treated in return. It would look like giving them the opportunity to make this right voluntarily before external pressure forces their hand. External pressure? Tavric, you're not the only person they owe money to. When word gets out about their situation, and it will get out, there are going to be creditors, business partners, and investors who want answers. Your story provides context for why their financial house of cards is collapsing. I hadn't considered the broader implications. The Kelvane family's problems wouldn't stay private once the foreclosure proceedings began. Are you saying I should threaten to go public? I'm saying you should be prepared for the fact that this story will become public, whether you want it to or not. The difference is whether you control the narrative or whether you let others define it for you. My phone buzzed again. Another call from Adeline. "They're not going to stop calling," I said. "No, they're not, which is why I think you should meet with them one more time, but on your terms, in a neutral location, with clear objectives for what you hope to accomplish." "A negotiation?" "A reckoning. They need to hear from you directly what this has cost you, not just financially, but emotionally. They need to understand that their behavior has consequences, and you need to hear them acknowledge what they've done." The idea was both appealing and terrifying. Part of me wanted nothing more than to disappear, to let them figure out their own problems while I rebuilt my life. But another part recognized that walking away without resolution would leave too many questions unanswered. "If I do this, will you be there, as a witness?" "If you want me there, absolutely. In fact, I'd recommend it. Having a neutral third party who understands the financial realities will keep the conversation honest." I looked at Richard's business card again, thinking about the strange chain of events that had brought us together. A broken-down car, a simple act of kindness, and now an unlikely alliance that might finally force the Kelvane family to confront the truth about themselves. "All right," I said, "let's do this properly." The conference room at Pinnacle Bank felt sterile under the fluorescent lighting as I sat across from the Kelvane family 3 days later. Harrison looked like he'd aged a decade since the reunion, his usual commanding presence replaced by the hunched shoulders of a man facing inevitable defeat. Vivienne clutched her designer handbag like a shield, while Adeline avoided my eyes entirely. Sterling fidgeted with his phone, probably calculating how long his trust fund would last once everything collapsed. Richard sat beside me, a stack of documents arranged precisely in front of him. "Thank you all for coming. I think it's important we address this situation directly." "This is unnecessary," Harrison began, but Richard cut him off with a raised hand. "Mr. Kelvane, your mortgage payment was due yesterday. When it wasn't received, foreclosure proceedings automatically began. You have 30 days before this becomes a matter of public record." The words hit the family like physical blows. Vivienne's face went white. Sterling's phone clattered under the table. "Tavric," Adeline said finally, her voice breaking. "We can fix this. We can make this right." "How?" I asked calmly. "By acknowledging that I've been your family's financial foundation for 8 years. By admitting that everything you own exists because of my factory wages." Harrison straightened, trying to reclaim some authority. "We're prepared to offer you a formal partnership in the pharmaceutical company. Full recognition of your contributions, profit sharing." "Your company is worthless," Richard interrupted, sliding a document across the table. "This is a complete financial analysis. Kelvane Pharmaceuticals has negative equity of $1.2 million. You're offering him a share of debt." Sterling leaned forward desperately. "What do you want? Money? We can arrange payments." "With what money?" I asked. "The money I've been giving you? The money that's gone to maintain your illusions while you called me dead weight?" The room fell silent, except for the hum of air conditioning. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued, my voice steady. "You're going to sell the estate. You're going to liquidate your assets. You're going to take responsibility for your own debts instead of expecting others to carry them." "And if we refuse?" Harrison asked weakly. Richard opened another folder. "Then these payment records become evidence in bankruptcy proceedings. Your creditors will learn that you've been accepting significant financial support while hiding your true situation. That's fraud, and it carries criminal penalties." Adeline looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Tavric, please, I love you." "You love what I provided," I replied. "There's a difference." Harrison slumped in his chair, finally understanding that the game was over. "What about the reunion guests? Our reputation?" "Your reputation was built on my sacrifices," I said, standing up. "Maybe it's time you built one on your own efforts." I walked toward the door, leaving them to face the wreckage of their choices. For the first time in 8 years, I felt the weight of dead expectations lifting from my shoulders. Behind me, Richard's voice was firm. "You have 24 hours to begin liquidation proceedings voluntarily. After that, the bank takes action." The door closed on their protests, but I didn't look back. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of North Point Manufacturing, but this time I wasn't clocking in for my shift. Richard had been true to his word about discussing my future, and that conversation had led to an opportunity I'd never imagined. The merger he'd saved by making his meeting had created new positions in the expanded bank, including a role in their community development division that seemed tailor-made for someone who understood what it meant to work for every dollar. The Kelvane estate had sold at auction 3 weeks after our bank meeting. Harrison and Vivienne had moved into a modest apartment in Millbrook, where Harrison now worked as a sales representative for a competing pharmaceutical company. Sterling had taken a position with a nonprofit organization, claiming he wanted to help people who'd faced financial difficulties. Whether that was genuine growth or calculated image rehabilitation remained to be seen. Adeline had filed for divorce the day after the bank confrontation. The papers were civil, even generous in their division of our limited shared assets. She'd moved back with her parents and, according to mutual friends, was working as a counselor at a financial literacy center. I hope she'd found something authentic in helping others navigate the kind of struggles her family had created for themselves. "Mr. Holtrowe?" The receptionist's voice pulled me back to the present. "They're ready for you in conference room B." I walked down the familiar hallway where I'd once supervised production lines, but today I was here for something different. The community outreach program Richard and I had developed was expanding, and North Point had agreed to partner with us in providing financial education and job training for people facing economic hardship. The conference room was filled with faces I recognized: former co-workers who'd agreed to volunteer their time, local business owners willing to provide training opportunities, and representatives from organizations serving families in crisis. At the head of the table sat Maria Santos, a single mother who'd been our program's first success story. She'd gone from facing eviction to managing a small business loan, and now she was helping others navigate the same journey. "Before we begin," Maria said, "I wanted everyone to know that this program has helped 47 families avoid foreclosure in the past 6 months. That's 47 families who get to stay in their homes because someone believed they were worth investing in." The number hit me harder than I'd expected. 47 families who wouldn't face the humiliation and displacement that the Kelvanes had ultimately brought on themselves. 47 families who'd learned that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness, but a step toward strength. "The thing about helping people," I said to the group, "is that it creates ripples you can't always see. Every person we help becomes someone who can help others. Every family that stays stable becomes a foundation for their community." After the meeting, I drove past the old Kelvane estate. The new owners had painted the exterior and replaced the fountain with a playground. A sign in the yard read Hillcrest Community Center, and I could see families using the grounds that had once been reserved for exclusive gatherings. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard: "Board approved the expansion. We're going statewide next year." I smiled, remembering the stranded businessman I'd helped on a highway 6 months ago. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is show them they're not carrying their weight alone. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving you were right, but using that proof to lift others up. Some people build walls to keep others out. I'd learned to build bridges that help people find their way home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.